All right. I'm gonna share my screen.
I gave you host privileges, so you should be able to do that.
I'm
There
honored.
we go.
Wow. You can see my screen?
I can see your screen. Looks great.
Wonderful. All right. So, I mean, the book Functional Training Anatomy, I'll just give you the background on how we came to even getting this book in the first place to come out. So, the people from Human Kinetics reached out to me about a year and a half ago and just asked me pretty much, would I be interested in a couple of different projects? So they had a few different ideas of like mobility book, anatomy book, things like that. And when we kind of parsed it out and volleyed back some ideas back and forth, we came out to this functional training anatomy idea. And essentially, Mike from Human Kinetics kind of gave me the green light to build a book based around the things that we do at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning and the things that we do at CFSC. So essentially a supportive anatomy text to explain why we choose the exercise that we choose and why we coach things the way that we coach things, and kind of like the whole idea from a technical standpoint about our philosophy. So, I mean, to be honest, this was something that they helped collaborate with me to come up with this idea. It's not like I came to them and pitched this as much as they threw some ideas out and then we kind of put our brain together to figure this out. And then in that process, we brought in Mary Kate Fight, who's my co-author and editor for this. She's really super smart. She's a PhD. She teaches at Springfield College. And when we brought her in as someone to, make my writing something that was digestible for everyone else to understand. It's important to have someone, as Brendan knows, to like be able to edit your work and clarify your message. And so she did an amazing job at that, with me being able to send her a bunch of the writing that I did, and she essentially breaking it down and editing, helping me clarify it, to get the message to be as clear and concise as possible. So that's kind of what we worked on over the last year and a half. And if you're familiar with the books from Human Kinetics, they have a bunch of books that are essentially titled like the Anatomy in Motion series. So if they have like Anatomy of Baseball, Anatomy of Training for Tennis, Anatomy of Basketball, and what they'll have is exercises or drills for those sports with the anatomy drawn over the photography by the illustrators that work for the company. It's pretty cool. So, like, for instance, in our book, we'll have, 90-90 hip stretch with the anatomy of the hip rotators and the anatomy of the pelvis all drawn in there. So you can see exactly what are the structures that we are trying to affect, or so why we choose single leg training, clearly demonstrated by the deep longitudinal stabilization system, like the adductors, like the lateral hip, like the QL, about why we choose single leg training. So it helps us to give a visual, illustrated look at why we choose the exercises that we choose. And we'll go through the entire program, from mobility to warm up and power to heavy implement power, and then hip dominant, knee dominant, push, pull, core. And then we actually have some example programs at the end that people could take and use, like a 2-day training program and a 4-day training program for the average athlete, right? And so we kind of want to just cover this entire MBSE philosophy in an anatomy text, and that's really what we did. So, yeah, I'm really excited about that. I never thought, if you had asked me, especially like when Brennan and I were in college, like would I write an anatomy book? That would probably not be my expectation. Although I love anatomy, I love the course. That wasn't something that really came to my head until I spoke to Human Kinetics, and then I thought like, oh my God, this could actually be really useful, especially for people who are CFSCs or people who are trying to learn from an anatomical standpoint why we choose the exercises that we choose, right? So,
And just to
kind of,
clarify, everyone might be familiar with the strength training anatomy book that I think everyone gets when they're a new trainer or you start to get into strength training, which is the picture of the jacked guy and girl who are doing leg extensions on the leg extension machine. And then it has the pictures drawn of their quad muscles working on the machine. So you basically did that book, but for functional training. Am I correct?
of course, yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
so I hope that book eventually, when you get into kinesiology or training 101 class in college, like when I was Brendan's TA, that they give you my book instead of that, right? So we're actually starting at a place of understanding functional training, right?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of going into the slide here, I've been working on putting together a functional training anatomy course for CFSC. And here are just some of the slides I have based on kind of a webinar we did before. And what I would talk about is, like, what is functional training? I think functional training is like controversial term in the fitness industry, because you have these purists who will say, oh, well, whatever you do is functional if you pick the right exercise. Like if I'm trying to get good at, swinging a hammer, I should just swing a hammer all day. Like they're total specificity people. Then there's people who take functional training and they stand on Bosu balls and do handstands and they look like a seal at the circus. We don't want either ends of the spectrum. Because if you're someone who actually trains people and you have half a brain, you should understand like what functional training means. So we're going to try to define it more clearly. So to me, functional training means we're purposely selecting exercises to improve a specific outcome. And then we're basing those selections on the structure and function of the human body. So it's not one or the other. Like, yes, if we want to get better at X, we should do X to practice that motor pattern. But also we're choosing to train people based on how the body works and thinking about the limitations, especially of the average client that comes in the door. And we're trying to build a system to support those people. The big thing is when you talk about specific outcome, the majority of us who are training people, these clients don't have specific outcomes in mind. They have very general outcomes, right? So for instance, like if Brendan comes in the door, he might not be trying to get better at a certain task. He's trying to be, lose a little bit of weight, be a little more fit, be a little stronger. Like he doesn't have an event he's training for, right? So again, there's no specific outcome. Like it's not like he's training for the Olympics. So then we're thinking the specific outcome is, okay, we have to pick exercises based on his limitations, his anatomy, and how can we check these very general boxes you see on the screen, right? He wants to feel better. He wants to improve his movement quality, increase his power, increase his strength, increase his cardiovascular fitness. And these are all pretty general but measurable goals. We could quantify every single one of these things in some way with a pretty general program. But then that means we're going to pick exercises based on how the human body works and specifically how his body works, right? So that's okay. They don't have to be very specific. 90% of general population clients are inside of the box, right? We always say, like, people say they want to think outside the box. Well, if you're a trainer, you're working inside the box 90% of the time. It's really not that exciting. It's just on Instagram, it's this world where there's stuff that are outside the box all the time. So, I mean, I think 90% of athletes, that means mobility training, active warm-up and movement skills, very general power and speed work. And that could be power and speed could mean doing a ladder or skipping. Doesn't mean they're doing sprints necessarily, depending on who you're working with. Push, pull, hip dominant, knee, core, and then general aerobic or anaerobic conditioning. Like all the things that you hear people talk about are things that are outside the box, things that are determined by anatomical abnormalities, extreme end ranges, skill-specific training, individual activities, or unique goals, right? These are all things that happen outside. It doesn't mean we're not going to do those, but for the majority of people who would pick up my book, or the people who pick up my book are training, that's probably not where most of their time is going to be spent. So we always try to define the difference between what we call like dead person anatomy and functional training anatomy. Functional anatomy. That doesn't mean dead and that person anatomy isn't helpful. It is. The stuff you learn in cadaver lab, really interesting. And you don't know anatomy, so you see a dead body on the table and you look at them and touch them and move things around. It's actually a really great experience, and I would recommend everyone to do it. But that body is dead and flat and not innervated, not affected by gravity the way a standing, living, healthy body is, right? So like basic dead personality is great for learning innervation, articulations, positions and sizes of muscles, the pronation and angle of certain tissues. Like you don't realize sometimes until you see a body on a table, like, oh my God, like look how that muscle, that glute actually attaches to my hip. See how much attachment point that takes on the outside of the pelvis. Or you look at an adductor and see how posterior an adductor magnus is. You realize how strong of a hip extender it is. You see all those things in dead person anatomy. But that still doesn't necessarily tell us the things we need to train when people are on their feet, right? So it's a great way to start, but I think you need to actually see people training, see people playing sports to help you make decisions about what exercises to choose, right? Origin insertion anatomy is muscle specific. Functional anatomy is action specific. What is the outcome we want? And then how do we choose exercise in the weight room to improve that outcome on the field or in a sport or on the court, whatever it is we're training for. So functional anatomy tells us what groups of muscles do together to create specific actions in specific positions under the force of gravity. Because once you're standing on your feet, a lot of the work your muscles do is just to keep you standing there, right? Not necessarily even always to just create the sporting outcome, but it's also to help keep us vertical. So you always have to take that into account because everything changes when you're vertical, and even more so, everything changes once you're on one leg, right? So just some examples, and I just tried to choose like 3 things out of the book to talk about. There's a lot of topics in there, so I figured if I could just talk about 3 quick little things that I could discuss in there. Number one, it's probably one of the biggest things we talk about and we hear in our industry is like, how do we train the hamstrings? How do we prevent hamstring strains? How do we rehab hamstring strains? Most common sports injury that we see. It's also the most common re-injury. Once someone has one, they're likely to get another one. And so a lot of controversy on, how do we train these things and how do we prevent them? And a lot of athletes are invested in that question. So see this guy running. Looks like Damian Perry in the short shorts running long distance here. So what do we know about hamstring injuries in sport? Is biceps femoris is most commonly injured. Usually when you see a person, a track athlete, NFL player, get a hamstring strain, it's usually in the belly or more proximal attachment of the biceps femoris. So that's generally what you see. It doesn't mean you don't see semimembranous and semitendinous strains, but typically a biceps femoris strain. It also most commonly happens during the terminal swing phase of gait. So if you look at this image on the screen here, it's pretty much right about at heel contact, somewhere between 1 and 2, right? Is right when that foot's hitting the ground. It's not necessarily as they pull through. It's not like as they can do the concentric action. It's right when that foot comes down to the ground. And we'll talk about why that is in 1 second. Mainly because that hamstring has so many jobs to do, right? The common thing if you ask someone, especially if they just took their, anatomy 100 at UMass class, they're going to say, oh, the hamstring flexes the knee. It flexes the knee is their main action. And it can flex the knee. If I stick my leg out right now from the desk and I, flex back and forth, it can make that action. But when you're running, it actually shares jobs with the obliques and with the glutes to control the position of the pelvis. It counteracts the obliques on the front side to help control anterior, posterior tilt of the pelvis. It assists the glutes in hamstring and hip extension. And then it also eccentrically controls extension of the knee. So if you think about what's happening as someone's running and that leg's coming forward. So if I looked at number 6 here on the screen and that leg is coming forward, there's high eccentric load decelerating the lower leg because they're extending that knee between 6 and 7 here. So there's a lot of eccentric load on the hamstring. It has to stabilize the pelvis from anterior to posterior position with the obliques. And then it has to rapidly help extend the hip. So it's got 3 jobs to do in that short phase of time between 6, 7, and before it comes back to 1, right? And so the problem is when you have your average person who has a hamstring strain, and I'll tell you from my experience working in the clinic, I tend to see weak obliques, poor control of the pelvis in the sagittal plane from anterior to posterior position, and I tend to see weak glutes and hip extension. So now you're left with a hamstring that has 3 jobs to do as one muscle, 1 eccentric, 1 isometric, and 1 concentric. So how's that muscle supposed to get the job done in a high stress, high speed sporting environment? It really can't. And so imagine if you showed up to work one day, I go to teach a CFSC course and I got 50 people. I'm supposed to teach it with Brendan and I'm supposed to teach it with Steve Bigelow. And those 2 jerks were out too late the night before. And I have to teach the course by myself. By the end of the day, I'm going to be grumpy and upset. And it's because I have to do 3 times as much work. That's what happens to a hamstring over time when people get a hamstring strain, is what I always say. And so over time, people tend to get a tendinopathy. It aches, it hurts, and then eventually it just snaps, right? Because it can't take that anymore. So if you want the mechanism of a hamstring strain, that's typically how those things go. And I bring that up because you need to understand how the hamstring strains work to be able to train them correctly. That is the essence of functional anatomy. Understanding what is the mechanism of a hamstring strain helps you choose the right exercise, right? Because if I took that person who just took anatomy 101 and they told me, oh, it's a flexor of the knee, then I would have just hopped on that leg curl machine and started cranking away, on my hammies with no thought of my obliques or my glutes and how those contribute to something like that happening. So, well, like I said, most athletes suffer with hamstring strains and have an increased hip flexion, anterior tilt, and medial knee rotation, all as a result of poor pelvic positioning, right? They have present in this like open scissor posture, like I have on the screen. Athletes suffering from hamstring strains tend to have reduced bicep femoris activation when compared to the glute on that side. They tend to be fairly weak in hip extension specifically. So like I said, if you're going to choose exercises like this, they're probably not going to help that athlete because they're only training they're only training knee flexion. They're not training hip extension. They're not training the core at all because that person's laying on their stomach. So there's really no demand there. But then if I show this elite athlete here, looking very lean before he does a slide board leg curl,
5 years ago,
you can see here, like, first off, we teach people to bridge first, right? And what can we see when they bridge? They're able to brace their obliques so they're not sticking their belly button up to the ceiling. They're able to extend their hips with their glutes and do that without getting a hamstring cramp. That just tells me they passed the basic test, right? And then from here, we could begin training the hamstrings eccentrically, which is usually where that hamstring strains. Is that's when a hamstring strain is over exceeded. They can't handle it eccentrically, and that's when that hamstring blows up. So simply choosing better exercises based on understanding what happens with the hamstring and the glute when we run and how a hamstring strain happens helps you make better exercise selections to prevent these injuries from happening in the first place. And I'll tell you from a personal experience at MBSC, we don't really see hamstring strains in our athletes. It's very rare. Brendan, can you still do that?
No.
It's very rare that that we have an athlete we've been training for a while that they're like, oh, I had a hamstring strain. Like, I'll tell you, we don't see them very often. I typically see hamstring strains get referred into us after someone gets hurt, and then we have to start to give them things like this to fix it. I think a hamstring strain is in like the preventable bucket of exercises if you have a great training philosophy behind you. But if you don't, then I think that you are right to let those things happen because you're not addressing the obliques and you're not addressing the glutes and so on and so forth. So, and there's another elite athlete. This must have been during Christmas time, doing single leg deadlifts. Again, strong eccentric strain there. So now another controversial topic in the world of fitness is core training specifically, or what is the purpose of core musculature, right? And if you just look at the structure here, you can kind of understand that it's meant to buttress force. Look at the angles and the pennation of all these muscles, right? They all kind of create a cylinder around the midsection. If you look at the transverse abdominis and diaphragm and multifidus, if you look at the internal external obliques and the lats, if you look at the rectus abdominis, they create like a cylinder around the midsection to create stiffness and create torque, right? Meanwhile, if you understand the degrees of motion at the spine, there's not huge degrees of motion besides flexion extension. There's not a lot of rotation. There's not even that much flexion extension. It's all segmental movement, not necessarily all at one segment. So it's not, the spine can move and it's able to be mobile, but it's not actually a piece of skeleton that is actually designed to move a lot. It's really meant to be buttressed by the muscles around it. And so if people are going to define what are the core muscles, I tried to think of everything that's at the rib cage to the pelvis. So I think the lats, the thoracolumbar fascia, the serratus posterior, ones that are not quite as come to mind when people say core muscles. Anything that can help to create stiffness in the thorax, I think kind of qualifies there. Don't forget the pelvic floor either on the bottom half of the cylinder. So one thing that I think people forget sometimes when they're training core muscles, especially with sports in relation to rotational activities, is they always think that like, oh, I need to do rotational based movements. Like I'm going to grab a plate and do this, or grab a band, or do twisty cable exercises like you see on Instagram. But power production isn't nearly as much about producing motion through the trunk as it is about controlling it. Like if you look at both of these monsters swinging a bat or throwing a punch, you can see there's not actually a lot of motion through their torso. The motion is in their hips, right? Mike Tyson isn't doing twisty cable exercises to learn how to hit somebody, right? He's moving his hips and bracing through his abdominals. You can clearly see what's going on there. Because the way you produce power is transferring force from the legs into the hands. You got these giant power generators at the bottom in your legs and your glutes and your hips. And then you're going to deliver it through your hands or through your upper body if you're swinging a bat, throwing a ball. So the core muscles aren't a producer as much as they're a transducer, right? You're creating force and stiffness briefly. You're pulsing to be able to transfer that force up the chain, right? If you're not able to create some stiffness in between the legs and the upper body, then when Escobar's swinging the bat there, he's just going to keep swinging because he wasn't able to brace and transfer that force into his hands. So huge impulses with relatively small amounts of motion and creating pulsing stiffness, like you've heard Stuart McGill talk about, is how you transfer that force from lower to upper. Like he did that study with GSP, swinging that ball mace thing around his head, right? And he was able to get all these core loads and see how he could reflexively turn his core on and off very quickly. Like intrinsically, his muscles would fire and brace when that ball came around the top so that he could keep that force going. And that's really what great athletes do better, right? I'm sure if you put those electrodes on Mike Tyson, they'd be off the charts when he was punching. I don't know who this is that he's punching in the face, but it probably hurt.
Holyfield after he bit his ear off.
Yeah. Hey, I'm sure the impulse was large.
Yeah, one of my favorite McGill quotes is also that, or one of my favorite stats from his studies is that Olympic lifters or people who Olympic lift have 5 times the reaction or the pulsing ability as the average person walking on the street. That's really what Olympic lifting teaches you. It teaches you how to contract, relax, and then contract. And the studies show you're about 5 times better at that than the average person.
And that's like the thing that, like, again, I actually wrote this in the Olympic lifting part of the book about pulsing. Is like the benefit is the main thing we do it for is power production in general, but teaching people to be able to have a nervous system that can do this, like sprinting, med ball throwing, that's what all of that does. And I guess that's power production, but a more malleable nervous system that can fire quickly. Because like you've taught beginners who like have slow elbows and cleans, right? They don't understand how to, you just want to be like faster. You don't know how to necessarily say it because it has to be learned, right? And that's why exercises like this guy is doing are probably not helpful to make you more powerful. You know, like Mike Tyson didn't do a lot of these to turn into who he was.
Yeah, I'll gladly get in a fight with that guy anytime.
But starting with like isometric rotational exercises, like this is pretty much with the stick mobility. Dennis Dunphy showed me this, and I really like this when I have people coming back from back pain, or if I have someone before we do something like a Palloff press, doing an isometric rotational exercise where I push the stick into the wall and brace and breathe, because it's rotary work, but it's isometric rotary work. And then working towards things like this. Look at this throwback. See that fresh haircut in this video here?
Look at that.
Yeah, this is old. Yeah, doing
Great
things
lineup.
like a push-pull exercise that starts, you know, pretty static like this, where I'm bracing my abdomen against rotary forces here. And then working our way up developmental progression to split stance, iso split stance position like this, and then going into standing here that's still static. Like I'm still trying to lock down my trunk to fight the rotary force, but then eventually earning my way to a dynamic progression, which I believe is next, hopefully. Yep. Where now most emotion is coming in my hips, right? My trunk is just along for the ride, but I develop some static stability first, right? And then same thing here. Again, being able to resist extension. I think control in the sagittal plane is really where everything starts. If you can't keep your ribs down and your pelvis under, you're going to have a hard time controlling any motion in the transverse plane if you're doing a rotary activity as well, right? And then lastly, we'll talk about single leg stance, because you weren't going to get a Mike Boyle webinar in any way if I didn't bring this up, right? So part of the reason I really stress this in the book is could put this anatomy into a picture of someone single leg squatting or someone split squatting, right? So Like literally, I think I have a picture of Ariel doing a single leg squat with all this drawn on here. And the reason everything changes on one leg is because of gravity, right? I challenge you all to stand up on two legs right now, pick one foot up. A whole different group of muscles has to work, right? That's why there's people who are strong as hell on two legs and can barely balance on one. It's because this lateral subsystem, this deep longitudinal subsystem has to work, right? Your QL, your glute med, your adductor, the TFL, like this whole stability system has to work to maintain position in the frontal plane and the transverse plane while the work and the action occurs in the sagittal plane. So I talk a lot about the idea of local stabilizing musculature and global movement, right? When you do a single leg squat, most of the action happens in the sagittal plane, right? You're going up and down. So some people would say, oh, that's still a sagittal plane, primarily a sagittal plane movement. But if all these muscles weren't working, you'd see my hip jump out in the frontal plane. You'd see my femur and my pelvis rotate in the transverse plane because I couldn't stabilize. So once you're on one leg, all these muscles have to work eccentrically and isometrically to help you maintain that position, even though the motion is happening primarily in the sagittal plane. And that's why single leg training, unilateral training in general, even in the upper body, is so valuable for sports, right? So much of traditional strength training is sagittally plane dominant, right? Because it's influenced by powerlifters, back squat, deadlift, bench press. And that's not to say those things aren't necessarily valuable. They just have less transfer to life on one leg, which is not just sports, but just how you live your life every day, right? The second you're on one leg, like I said, you're dealing with multiplanar forces. For Nick in this picture to be able to keep his pelvis centered over his femur and his knee in the position he wants and his foot in the position he wants, he has to have muscles that are going to help maintain those positions where the arrows are, right? And if he's not strong in his obliques, if he's not strong in his adductor and his lateral hip, and he's not strong in his plantar muscles in his foot, then he's going to be in trouble, right? And so that's why developing single leg training from an early age for athletes and just everyday people is so valuable. Global movement is still in the sagittal plane, like I said, but local stability lives in the frontal and transverse plane, and you get those things in single leg training. And then the position will dictate the function. If you do these exercises with poor positioning and poor coaching, you're probably not going to get the things that we want. So if you see, like, let me pause this with Case in here as he goes down. Oh, let me go back here. As he goes down, you see his head is over his hip, is over his knee, is over his foot, right? So when all those things are lined up, he's able to use his adductor to maintain his pelvic position. He's able to use his lateral hip to maintain his femur position. And then all of that's going to dictate his foot position, right? If he's doing this with a valgus knee or a pelvis that's rotated way out, then he's not getting the benefits of single leg training that we want. So it also comes down to how we coach things and the positions we coach people into at the same time. So realizing that position dictates the function. So there's still some onus on you as the coach to coach things well, even if you select the right exercises.
Real quick, can you explain global movement versus local stability for everybody?
Exactly. So I'm going to hit play on this video. Everyone look at this video of Lisa doing lunges, right? Mm-hmm. We can all agree she's primarily moving in the sagittal plane, correct?
Right.
Right? All that motion. Yep. Same thing with Kaysen. He's primarily moving in the sagittal plane, correct? Right. However, if we'll go back to, get one of them mid-rep here to be a good example, like right there. However, if he has the inability to stabilize his pelvis in the frontal plane as it goes side to side, what's going to happen to him? His hip's going to swing out. He'll probably lose his balance, right? If you've ever taught a beginner to single leg squat who couldn't single leg squat, what happens? Their pelvis pops out, right? Or they lose stability in the transverse plane, in the frontal plane, and their knee dips in, or they fall to the other side. So what's happening while he's doing this to make this single leg squat look so easy is his lateral hip stabilizers are helping to keep his pelvis level. His adductors helping to keep his pelvis centered over his femur. So there's stability, isometric and eccentric stability work going on in all these muscles, even though his glute, hamstring, and quad might be the prime movers going up and down. His adductor, his glute med, his oblique are helping keep his whole pelvis stable. And that's the stuff that helps prevent things like ACL injuries, helps prevent things like back injuries, because he's able to keep himself in one position. So that's the stuff that I think like the powerlifting hardos miss out on when they're like, oh, I just got to do two leg work. Well, I want to see you cut and change directions at full speed. And I'm going to bet on me beating you to the ball or getting to the line quicker than you, or your knee blowing up because you can't maintain the position that you want. And that's really what we get out of single leg work or unilateral work, is those local stability muscles working eccentrically and isometrically to help you maintain position.
So when you're moving in a straight line, gravity is trying to pull you left, right, or twist you, and your ability to resist it is your ability to stabilize, while gravity is trying to pull you in every which direction so that you can move forward.
Again, and that's why coaching is so important, right? Because as a coach, when you say to this kid, Kason, I say, Kason, I want your head over your hip, over your knee, over your foot. Get yourself lined up. And then putting him in positions by reaching the dumbbells out and across his body. What's the cue we always tell people? Reach the dumbbell across your femur. Because what's that do? It helps him center himself over his hip, which helps him get the glute on and get the adductor on, right? Because we cued it right. Whereas if the coach picks a single leg squat and doesn't cue it, then it might not matter because he can't get into positions to get those muscles to work. So exactly. We want to be able to get those local stability muscles working. And that's the same thing with like a single leg deadlift. Get your pelvis squared up over your femur, right? Any of those types of things. So quick references, some books that have strongly influenced me. I have a lot of people ask me for anatomy books, and these are the top 3 books I would recommend everybody to read. Donald Newman book is probably the most influential anatomy book I've read. I reread it a lot. Kinesiology of the musculoskeletal system. You can get this on Amazon. It's like based on rehab, so it's really practically based book. Very, very good. Tom Michaud's Human Locomotion. It's based on gait, so it gives you a really good idea of the muscles working when you run, when you walk. And then Shirley Sarman's a classic of diagnosis, treatment, and movement impair syndrome. So those 3, I think, could really get you off to the races. And then get mine too. Mine would be.
I was going to say, can I just read your book? I don't want to read those other ones.
Mine will be I probably just, like Mike said, you just steal from everybody else. So mine will be a distillation of those 3 books into mine. So, so exactly. Well, I hope that gives you guys an idea of the things where I'm going to talk about my book. That's just scratching the surface because, like I said, we go through the whole program. But I figured those are 3 of the bigger things and more common topics I have people ask about when it comes to training.
How many exercises do you have in the book? What do you have, 40? How many pictures did you take?
Have you been, how many pictures? I took about 400 pictures. They're not all in there though.
Got it.
If you've been to a CFSC course, all of those exercises are in there and then some. So
it's 44. The CFSC course has 44 exercises.
So probably about 50 or so.
50.
In each chapter, like there's an intro, a preface, and then each chapter has like a section that talks about why that type of training is important. Like why mobility work, like what's the idea behind mobility work? What's the idea behind warm up? What's the idea behind power, right? Whatever. And then we go through each exercise with an explanation of why we choose this exercise, coaching cues for each exercise, demonstrations for each exercise, and then alternatives and regressions. So, hey, a split squat, you want to make it harder, go to a rear foot elevated split squat. Here's an explanation of that with pictures and demos. Hey, you want to make it easier, go to this, right? And so I want it to be like a manual that someone could pick up at the store and understand what a basic training program should be, and then the anatomy that backs that up. And at the end, like I said, there's 2 programs, a 2-day and a 4-day program for you to follow.
Sweet.
Yes.
All right.
So, and the reason, so that'll be out. Hopefully you'll be able to pre-order in February and have it by March. It's just a matter of the artwork. We're supposed to get artwork proofs on the 5th. So hopefully this week I'll post or share what some of the images will look like, and possibly cover images might look like this week. So let's cross our fingers for that there.
Yeah, right. Who knows with timelines these days?
You never know.
You never know.
Mean, well, let's just get through November 3rd. And we'll visit everything
That's
else.
why we did this. That's why we did this tonight. All right.
Exactly.
Well, all right. That's funny. It's
awesome.
funny
So
that's actually the first time I've actually had you like tell me about the book too, other than it was functional training anatomy. That was,
Yeah, see, this is good. I was excited.
and
So,
not functional anatomy training.
Fat training.
Fat training. So functional training anatomy. All right. Well, I guess that means I'm up. So here we go. Well,
yes, Carlos Felix will translate everything into Portuguese.
Yes, he is on it. So he's already working with my publisher, Laurie Draper of On Target Publishing, to get that in Portuguese. And so I guess how this book came about, I guess my story is a little bit different than yours, is that I always knew I wanted to write a book. I just had no idea what it would be about. And I take the mindset of, I think it's a Benjamin Franklin quote that says, if you want to write, you got to have something to write about. And I never felt like I had anything to write about until the past few years. So I've been doing this will be year number 12 that I'm on. So the first 11 years I spent training people, running the internship program. And really what this book stems from is the internship program that Kevin and I ran for 2 or 3 years. And there was a article that I wrote for the entire staff at MBSC, or the interns coming in for the summer. We have 22 to 25 interns every summer. And I wrote an article that was 34 things I wish I knew before I started at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, just to like get it right out there. These are the things I wish I had known and didn't have to figure out after working there for a year, that I would have loved to have just gotten out of the way. And actually all 34 of those things are in this book. And when I read the book Food Rules by Michael Pollan, which is, I don't want to say it's a dumbed down version of nutrition, expert nutrition advice, but really it's a simplified but brilliant, easily consumable tips for everybody. And that's what I wanted this book to be, because maybe unlike Kevin, who's very much more into the studies and the science of things, I would put myself on maybe the big picture and the experience type things. And this is why I think Kevin and I work so well together, is because if it involves science or a paper, I defer to him and I just ask him where can I find that study or that number that I'm looking for. So Michael Pollan's Food Rules is eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And if anyone asks him what they should do for nutrition, that's his answer. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants, and not too much of it. So I thought, well, what if somebody asked me like, well, how do I be a good coach? Communicate clearly, do no harm, keep it simple, and serve others. So there are 4 very actionable items. And actually, number 4 was going to be don't make it about you. But it's not making it about you wasn't really as actionable as serving others is. So those are the 4 things. Like if it comes down to it and you don't read the book, if you want to be a really good coach, if you can communicate clearly, do no harm, and keep it simple and serve others, you're probably going to do all right. And I wanted to write a how-to manual for a successful career in strength and fitness, because I feel like there's a lot of stuff on theory, like things that should work or might work that you should try, but there weren't things that like, this is exactly what you should do. Here are the rules. Most of the time it'll work. Now that's the thing about rules, is that rules are good guides, they're good guardrails, but it doesn't eliminate thinking for yourself. So rules are a guideline, they're a guardrail that are going to keep you on the right path, but at some point you will have to make different decisions, or it just leads you to a better decision in the end. I will get out of here so I can go through this. I don't want to make you all look page by page. So we start with, I was lucky enough to ask Coach Boyle, or have Coach Boyle write the foreword, and Dan John to write the preface. So if nothing else, really good, and they're both hilarious. So it's worth reading it just for those two things. And I believe on the Kindle, you can actually read them right now. I believe with the Kindle release, you get to read the forward and the preface and the introduction.
I like that we both had Mike write forward.
Oh, he wrote yours? I didn't know.
Yes, that's so funny. He goes, he said, "Oh, this is my favorite part because I can like joke about you guys."
Oh yeah, he wrote. My favorite part of his forward was.
Yeah, give us an excerpt, please.
What does any of this have to do with this book? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. It was about my story about moving to California. So I'll let you read the book later. But what does this have to do with his book? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Now, there were 6 things that I came up with as what do the how-tos help you with as a coach? So the 6 biggest obstacles that I believe that you have as a coach are complacency. We get complacent and then we stop getting better. Egotism, because a lot of trainers like to make it all about them and their workouts. Poor communication, lack of connection, overcomplication, and then client attrition. So if you can't keep clients, you're not going to have a job for very long. With the idea being that this book is made for trainers who want to make this a career. I'm slated to retire in 2055, which would be 46 years of training. And I can tell you right now, when I'm 50 years old, I don't want to be waking up at 5 a.m. in the morning to train people or staying in the gym until 8 at night, especially if I'm gonna do this for a long time. So those 6 things are what you need to be able to mitigate with these 4 items, which are communicate clearly, do no harm. So communicate clearly is going to be coaching cues and demoing. Do no harm and keep it simple are all of my programming rules. So there's 50 programming rules, there's 30 communication rules, and then serve others is thinking about yourself, your legacy. Like, what kind of coach do you want to be? The coach that has 500,000 Instagram followers, or the coach that changed a couple thousand lives? Like, what do you want on your coaching tombstone? And there's 25 rules for that. And there's 105 rules total. And then at the end of each section, I'll share my screen again. At the end of each section, so we can see here, we have all the rules. We have a deliberate practice. Now, the other problem with a lot of books or courses is that it's just a lecture, or it's just something that you read and then you go to your next book. What I wanted was something that was almost workbook-like, or something that challenged you, that would force you to actually practice these things, these items deliberately. So exercise number 1 is coaching skills and learning how to communicate clearly. So what you do is you film yourself coaching a squat, a push-up, a deadlift, a chin-up, or a dumbbell row, and a front plank. Then I have about 20 questions you ask, or rules that you go through, and you say, okay, I kept it really short. I used external cues. I put my hands in my pockets. That's not good. And so you check off all the rules that you did and didn't do, and then you go back and you redo the videos again, and you keep improving on them. And eventually what you have is you have a YouTube library, which if you don't have a YouTube library now, especially in the world that we're in, you're way behind. Like, it's unfortunate. Some people don't want to do it, but you are behind if you don't have a YouTube library to send people videos, or so people can see who you are, especially if you want to make
Movement is Medicine has a great YouTube library if you want to subscribe.
Shameless plug. The second part of that is that you're going to film yourself actually coaching a full session with a client, and you should have your boss or another coach film you coaching a group or a one-on-one client for an entire hour. All the best teams and athletes watch film of themselves. It shouldn't be any different for coaches. You should watch film of yourself, because that's how you improve. if people ask how Kevin and I improved at becoming better speakers, although we're not super speakers or anything, but we've definitely improved. I can tell you that from 10 years ago. But the way you improve at speaking is you watch yourself speak. And it is really difficult to do. I hate the sound of my voice, but you do it because it makes you better. Then programming, what I want you to do is grab 3 to 5 of your programs that you're currently using, and you're going to go line by line, exercise by exercise, and ask yourself, why have I programmed this exercise? And you have to answer that. You have to defend your program as if it's your dissertation or a PhD, or you are in a court of law and the jury and the judge want to know why you put that exercise in there. Not because like, oh, well, like that's just a warm-up exercise. Everybody does warm-up exercise. That's not a good answer about why that exercise is in there. Finally, why do you want to coach? So again, if you want to keep this as a job, this is probably the wrong book for you, because if you're just doing this for fun and it's a second job or a hobby, that's fine. Like there's going to be those people forever. If you want to make this a career, you want to ask yourself, what's your legacy going to be if I'm going to do this for the next 30 years? So there's 6 questions that you sit down and answer. So what kind of impact will I have on my clients in the next 20 years? What do I want to accomplish in the next 10 years? Based on those answers above, what will you need to do 3 years from now and this year, 90 days? And then I want you to write your own testimonial as if you were your own client. What do you want your clients to say about working with you? So we have communicate clearly, which is going to be your coaching skills. You're going to film those videos, and then you're going to work on the 35 rules that go along with communicate clearly. Exercise 2, or the second half of the book, is going to be a combination of do no harm and keep it simple, because those are my 2 programming rules, and there's about 40 to 50 rules to go through that. And then you audit a bunch of the programs that you're doing, and then I teach you how to rewrite those programs so that they're more specific to the person that you're working with. And then the third half of the book, the final 25 rules, is what do you want your legacy to be? Why do you want to coach, and why do you want it to be your career? And so then you answer all those questions, and for 2 weeks to a month, you go back and you re-answer those questions. And then I challenge you to either, I know Kevin, you do this on your birthday every year, you do goals instead of New Year's, but once a year, I want you to go back and write down I want you to work on your training philosophy, your mission statement, and like rewrite your obituary basically as a coach. And so that's the challenge. And the challenge too is that you pick up the book every couple of years or so after you've done the deliberate practice, and you do it again and you keep improving on it. So
I like how you made it so intentional for people. Also because, like you just said it, I was thinking about that before you said it too, was that it's a book that it's not a book you read once. It's a book you can pick up again and intentionally practice it again, because all of those things, as you get older in your career, you can change how you do those things, or your perspective on how you carry out your career is a little different than it was when you ran the internship versus who you are now. Your goals are different. Your daily routine is different. The way you communicate is different. Your goals are different. So it's good. You wrote a book that,
I hope it
stay
timeless
with someone. It'll grow.
Right. I hope
it grows
timeless
with people. Yeah, that's what you want. That's amazing.
So it's funny you mentioned that. So the ground rules, which I breezed over to get to the main rules, but I have 6 ground rules. So these are the 6 things you need to think about or remember before you read the book. That number 1, context matters, because I can see a lot of people reading this book and being like, well, that's a stupid rule. That doesn't apply to me. And you're right, it doesn't. It doesn't apply to all situations. These rules apply to most situations, but not all situations, right? So context matters. The same knife that you cook with is the same knife that could kill you. It just depends on the context in which you use it. So there's a bunch of these rules that will not fit into your training population, your philosophy, but I'm guessing that 80% of them will. But there's a few that won't, and that's totally fine. Just remember that when you raise your hand and you say, well, what about the person that has no arm, right? You're like, well, then that's the context changes my answer. So that's rule number one, always. Number two, it's good in theory, not in practice, right? And that may be the best, or the reason why I wrote this book is because there's a lot of good theory, but then you read the theory and you try the theory out in your gym and you're like, well, that did not work at all. So I tried to make this book more about the practice and things that we practice throughout our career, Kevin, and at MBSC. Then when you know the rules, you can break the rules, right? So we said they're guardrails, but that doesn't mean you can't go over the guardrail or go around the guardrail. They just keep you on a path for a little while, but you can go off the path. But if, as John Wooden says, if you spend too much time learning the tricks of the trade, you may never learn the trade, right? So this is the people who always want to think outside the box, but they never learn what's inside the box. I reserve the right to change my mind at any time. So 3 years from now, I hope I don't agree with everything in this book, because like you could mention, Kevin, we're going to continue to grow. And I hope to write multiple follow-up versions of this, or have, what are they called when you write the second, third, and fourth edition? Yeah. I hope I have a bunch of different editions of this book to improve upon it every 3 to 5 years.
Do you have quotes at every chapter and every rule like this too?
No, so I would say in 50% of the rules I do.
Nice.
But I tried to put quotes in every one of them, but then I realized I was really reaching for some and they didn't make sense. And I was like, all right, I gotta, if I could think of a quote that I thought went really well, then it made sense, then I did it. But if I was reaching for straws, then I cut it out.
All right. I like those. I like that I love quotes.
I know, right? Real number 5, steal smart people's shit. That's called learning, Mike Boyle. But good artists copy, great artists steal. So like you said, your book is a compilation of those three other books. You just wrote it and packaged it in a way that makes sense to you in simpler terms. My book is a combination of a lot of Dan John, Mike Boyle, like everybody that we've watched or spoke to over the last whatever many years, condensed into the way I see it, or the lens I look through. And what you just were talking about, Kevin, you never read the same book twice, right? You can never step into the same book twice, because each time you read it, you're different. So that's why I want you to develop a relationship with this book, one that you can keep coming back to often. So those are my ground rules, the 6 things that I want you to remember before you read the book, and then drink it on in. And remember, you're not going to agree with all of it, and that's fine with me. I don't want you to. So that's it.
Very exciting. Go out and pre-order on Amazon right now. You can start reading the Kindle. You can start reading the Kindle before it arrives.
Yeah, right. Lucky you. So